On the morning of April 12, 2005, three police officers patrolling on foot in Baltimore's Gilmore Homes housing project made eye contact with Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old black man, who attempted to flee upon noticing their presence. The officers gave chase and arrested Gray without incident, loading him into the back of a police van for transport into custody. 30 minutes and 4 stops later, Gray lay comatose on the floor of the vehicle, with a fractured cervical vertebra and most of his spinal cord severed at the neck, injuries that the medical examiner's report compared to those incurred in shallow diving accidents. Freddie Gray's death was ruled a homicide by omission, as he was unlawfully left unattended, bound by the wrists and ankles, without a seatbelt or any proper safety restraints. His cries for help along the ride went unheeded until it was far too late, and a week after his arrest, he was pronounced dead. Gray's death sparked outrage in his city and all over the country. Protests erupted on the streets of Baltimore, and the vicious, socially reproduced cycle we have all but grown accustomed to by now ensued. All 6 officers initially charged with crimes were eventually acquitted, and seemingly alongside it dissipated all the righteous fury and accompanying civil disobedience. This is a picture of Freddie in his childhood home. He was born critically premature to a mother addicted to heroin and spent his first months of life in the hospital trying to gain weight. At 2 years of age, the levels of lead in his blood were over 10 times the CDC's current threshold for childhood lead poisoning. He struggled his entire academic career in special education classrooms, never graduated high school, and ran afoul of the law on numerous occasions. In 2010, Freddie and his family won a sizable settlement against their landlord, who failed to remove lead paint from the household. As typical in cases like lead exposure, where long-term disabilities and in particular permanent neurological damages are incurred, the settlement was to be structured in periodic payments over Freddie and his family's life, ostensibly to guard against the type of fiduciary mismanagement one might expect from a cognitively impaired person that has lived the entirety of his life in a constant state of immiseration and abject poverty. Less than 3 years later, however, Freddie forfeited the rights to that structured settlement, worth $435,000 at the time, to a factoring company who purchased it for a lump sum of just $54,000. Let's review for a moment the sweep of this case, which is not really all that unique in our current social arrangement. A child is born in circumstances that can only be described as utter deprivation in what is arguably the richest and most powerful country in the world. He is poisoned from birth, figuratively by dint of his socioeconomic predicament, and literally by lead fragments lining his lungs and gullet, arresting the development and consequent functioning of his brain. The one reprieve he is afforded, a sizable structured debt, won from his landlord for failing to remove the aforementioned poison, was quickly bought for pennies on the dollar by a predatory factoring company that literally makes its profits on a gigantic secondary market off of vulnerable tort victims like Freddie. All this before being battered to death, helpless and immobilized in the back of a van by 6 police officers who ultimately faced no formal consequences. You don't have to be a moral philosopher to ascertain there are profound injustices endemic to an arrangement that reproduces more or less these circumstances for thousands of children every year. What do we, broadly defined and collectively, owe people like Freddie? What is justice in concept and in practice? What does it look like here? In this video, we will analyze the problem of lead contamination through 2 opposing philosophical conceptions of justice: a procedural libertarian account provided by Robert Nozick and Murray Rothbard, and a distributive account furnished by Peter Wenz. We will then attempt to reconcile the 2 into a coherent framework that revolves around the everyday concept of debt.
Lead is a ubiquitous heavy metal that occurs naturally in the surface of the earth. Its use has spanned the historical record, and throughout time and culture it has been employed as a contraceptive, jewelry, construction material, seasoning, and even as a stimulant. The Romans used it to line their extensive networks of water pipes, and Caravaggio, Goya, and Van Gogh were all thought to have been suffering from the deleterious effects of its toxicity. What then does lead do exactly to the human body? When lead enters the body, usually from exposure to contaminated food, water, commercial products, or air, it accumulates in blood, soft tissues, and the bone, where it can persist for weeks, months, or even years, respectively. Lead has no identified physiological role, and it wreaks havoc on a myriad of biological processes across every single organ system. There is no safe or acceptable level of it in the human body. Its effects on children are compounded, as they absorb proportionally more lead than adults, and their growing bones, where most exogenous lead accumulates, provides more opportunities for reintroduction to the bloodstream and soft tissues. Lead damages the structure of cells in the human body by creating reactive radicals, which impair the function of cell membranes and DNA. It also interferes with a plethora of enzymatic activity essential to biological processes like transcription and the synthesis of vitamin D. Vitamin DeMike. Perhaps the most salient effect that lead poisoning, otherwise known as plumbism, has is on the nervous system. When lead crosses the blood-brain barrier in a child, it interferes with synapse formation in the cerebral cortex, confounds the organization of ion channels, and perturbs neurochemical development and function. Long nerve demyelination, decreased neuron counts, and overall stunted brain growth are what result. Mike Tyson, Dr. DeMike Tyson. There's a large body of academic literature on the link between lead and crime. Some theorists attribute the decline of violent crime observed in the 90s to the antecedent banning of lead and gasoline and paints in the 70s and 80s. Nevertheless, it is still a huge public health concern today. Cases like Flint, Michigan make headlines and serve the public awareness. However, there are thousands of neighborhoods across the country that are just as, if not more, contaminated than Flint at the height of its crisis. Places in Pennsylvania, Missouri, and Wisconsin that wouldn't draw a second glance from the eye of the media. Suffice to say that in general, it is uncontroversial that lead poisoning has profound social implications, and consequently that the distribution of this particular environmental contaminant, and by extension the policy that shapes it, has major repercussions in actual lives of people all over the country. Alright, so like the premises I'd like to talk about here in terms of environmental justice, they begin with like a few simple observations which I don't really think most people find too controversial. Like the first claim I'd like to make is that our current practices for distributing environmental harms is straight up racist. Seriously, not explicitly maybe or even intentionally, but that's part of what makes it so like messed up, right? Like you have all these rich and powerful elites, captains of industry, financiers, people who either make like a shit ton of money in like an extractive mode of production or in the complex ways we dream up to financialize and further commodify those products in the abstract. And they've created like a culture predicated on material consumption and endless economic growth. And that activity generates externalities, which is like the euphemism that economists like to use for toxic garbage that poisons everyone and everything around it. Fucking sucks shit. And like the way things are, that shit doesn't even get dumped anywhere near those who are wealthy enough and by extension consumptive enough to even be reasonably complicit in its generation. It gets like dumped next to poor people who don't really have any political power to object and can't really afford to like go anywhere else. And like poor people in this country tend to be like black or brown. It follows that like non-whites shoulder more of the environmental burdens associated with our mode of production than whites. That's fucking racist, bro. Straight up. More specifically, that's environmentally racist. So like my theory of justice is like a distributive one. It prescribes a principle, the principle of commensurate benefits and burdens, to inform a just alternative distribution system to the insane one we're lashed to right now. Totally chained up. It's like our fucking wallet chain's caught up in this system. It's like we fucking snagged our gauges on this fucking system. We can't get off. Our fucking wallet chain's all tied up. So like what is the principle of commensurate benefits and burdens? Well, like super simple. It's the supposition that people who derive benefits should shoulder their commensurate burdens. Like we can easily formulate some classic dyads as examples. One might shoulder the burden of work for like the benefit of fair wages or expect the burden of tort liability with the benefit of ownership. When I moonlight as Fall Out Boy's bass guitarist, I enjoy the benefits of representing the height of human aesthetic achievement in the sartorial proclivities of the early aughts. Hundreds of thousands of adoring 20-something-year-old fans and untold riches. I also commensurately shoulder the burden of wanting to kill myself, knowing that everything we've ever written since 2005 is soulless, commercial garbage devoid of any artistic or creative merit. Even like one-sided arrangements that appear an exception to this principle, such as like, cases of inherited wealth or government welfare programs for the poor, require some sort of justification.
I mean, if you think about the way people tend to grumble about unearned generational wealth or handouts from the government disassociated from work, you can see the underlying prejudices towards this principle in our basic attitudes. Note that this principle is commensurate on a particular level. The burdens one should shoulder are directly related to the actual benefits incurred and are not like abstractly aggregated or apportioned or whatever. My idea is like a super simple one. The affluent, who derive the most benefit at the expense of the environment, should incur the commensurate burdens of their activity. I propose that a point system be devised that weighs particular types of harms and locally undesirable land uses. This point system would then serve as an index for each provincial community. More affluent ones would be required to earn a certain amount of points commensurate to their consumptive activity. Thus, the distribution of locally undesirable land uses would be like apportioned according to those who are most responsible. I refrain from offering any concrete political program for achieving this state of affairs, however. Like the justice I offer, radical as it may sound, seems to me as fair a way as any to militate against the type of environmental injustice and inequality that has become part of our status quo. It's bullshit. Not rock and roll, dude.
So, let us ruminate for a while on the concept of justice. Actual justice, not the distorted type parroted around on woke college campuses by blue-haired, postmodern, neo-Marxist ideologues. You see, the way that the concept has traditionally been framed is from the standpoint of distribution, which I think is totally inappropriate and antithetical to the very ethos of the Western intellectual tradition writ large. All the social justice types seem to care about is equality of outcome. That's their idea of justice. And you can trace its murderous genealogy back to Marx and the horrendous crimes committed in the last half of the 20th century in the name of that utopian ideal. It's high time we disabuse a notion of justice that prescribes any sort of geometric, egalitarian distribution. That's simply an invitation to tyranny. Let's instead consider a procedural account of justice, one predicated on the primacy and inviolability of the individual and the processes by which particular distributions arise. The equality that Western democracies have enshrined into the law is not one of outcomes or even opportunities, but one of basic entitlement. We are afforded the right to make use of our own individual capacities and autonomy to do whatever we wish, provided we do not impinge upon others' rights. It is implausible, unnatural, and undesirable to engineer and enforce any sort of distribution that artificially patterns society to some leftist utopian concept dreamt up in ivory towers. This delusion necessarily involves state coercion and is inimical to liberty itself. Robert Nozick, one of the greatest political philosophers in the Western analytical tradition, formulates an entitlement theory of justice that begins with personal liberty as its starting point and enumerates three overarching principles that govern the formation of so-called just distributions: justice in acquisition, justice in transfer, and justice in rectification, all of which Nozick characterizes as complicated truths that he does not explicitly spell out, but which can in general illuminate the nature of justice as a procedural construction. According to Nozick, a distribution is just only if the processes by which it has arrived accords with the aforementioned principles. He does not specify exactly what justice in acquisition looks like, but does invoke John Locke's proviso as something that seems to resemble it, insofar as an individual who owns himself can mix his labor with something previously unowned in nature and therefore lay a legitimate claim to it. The import of the overarching argument, however, is its formal implications for our conception of justice in everyday life. A distribution need not be remotely equal to be just, provided that the processes that were invoked to arrive at that distribution were legitimate. Indeed, we are all endowed as individuals with wildly disparate abilities and talents and motivations. It would seem absurd to reduce the swath of human ingenuity and capacity for productive activity to the flattened economic landscape of the socialist or the anarchist. The institution of private property and the sanctity of voluntary transactions are in fact central to any robust conception of justice. It is precisely the sort of calls for centralized redistribution, universal programs, and ostensible social correctives that actually do the most damage to justice on a fundamental level. They all require the abrogation of personal liberty and the theft of entitled holdings to instantiate the voluntary interactions that mediate exchange between free individuals, which take place in the market today, are ultimately the most efficient and, more importantly, the most just way to arrange holdings. Calls for social justice are naive to the fact that the type of action engendered therein are injurious to the entitlements of the individual and are therefore themselves unjust.
What are we to make of this philosophical bifurcation that demarcates procedure from distribution? Does it even make sense to commit yourself to one or the other? Libertarians like Murray Rothbard, at least in the realm of ecology, are fairly unconvincing, and his remarks on the solutions to complex environmental problems haven't aged particularly well. The faith that Rothbard has in private enterprise and capitalism as a whole reeks of the same teleological bent that Lynn White Jr. characterizes in religion, albeit indexed to something quite a bit more profane, and his dismissal of the environmental movement writ large betrays a lack of charity and intellectual seriousness. Rothbard's antagonism to government, and in particular what he views as the mismanagement of ocean fisheries in the context of ecology, smacks of Hardin's specious tragedy of the commons, and can be similarly combated by invoking someone like Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics, that demonstrated over years of research that common pool resource institutions can and do flourish without government intervention. Nozick, who was a rigorous and brilliant thinker, emphasizes principles of justice in acquisition, transfer, and rectification, and anticipates the primary critiques that could feasibly be levied against him, namely that those principles are nigh impossible to positively elucidate given the historical complexity of something like initial acquisition. Still, if we pardon Nozick for the lack of positive articulation, his premises seem readily acceptable, at least on an analytical level. Nozick's procedural justice is actually compatible with many potential distributions. He is not particularly concerned with the end-state distribution so much as the process by which it is arrived at. In the case of our friend Freddie Gray, however, there doesn't seem to be much that is ultimately useful. In the chapter of Anarchy, State, and Utopia that deals with distributive justice, the principle of rectification, which seems most salient in our case, is coincidentally the one that Nozick spends the least amount of time and effort elaborating on, and the odd, probability-based mathematical algorithm he offers for calculating rectification seems strange given the historical complexity and contingency involved with any counterfactual. It almost reminded me of liberal means testing. There also seems to be something arbitrary and by definition inimical to the concept of justice with building a philosophical conception of justice that is resigned to what is almost certainly an unjustified set of initial distributions in the first place. Wentz's commitment to distributive justice based on the principle of commensurate burdens and benefits is actually, in my view, a fairly robust and even-keeled application of a principle that enshrines key features of justice as a family of related concepts. The principle is clearly articulated, impartial, and takes seriously the equal interests of all parties involved. Wentz, in similar fashion, deigns to offer a political program for instantiating his ideas. He is not so much not concerned about the processes involved as he is probably cognizant of the fact that actuating his program would likely be impossible by any conventional, legitimate procedure. The fact that Wentz's proposal seems too far-fetched and radical when it arises from perfectly reasonable and sound premises is an indictment of our own relationship to nature, each other, and the social arrangements we reify. There are alternatives on offer that don't commit themselves exclusively to the domain of procedure or distribution at the expense of the other. Both seem salient given the complexity and scope of the interconnected problems we face today. One such way of formulating justice, I propose, is to reframe it in the colloquial language of debt. In many ways, the concept of justice is tied closely to the concept of debt. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy offers a Justinian definition of justice as the constant and perpetual will to render to each his due. This concept presupposes, firstly, that the subject is in a position to render to another something they are entitled to, and secondly, that by dint of its constancy and perpetuity, this will to render is not merely instrumental or transactional, but rather a quintessential feature of moral life. Nietzsche, an ardent and incisive critic of moral systems, posited in his genealogy of morals that the relationship between debtor and creditor and the sanctions engendered therein gave rise to feelings of personal obligation and morality itself. He notes that the human proclivity for measuring and comparing and exchanging things is so ingrained into our thinking that it may be an unavoidable part of the critical faculty itself. He even characterizes traditional cultures, with their rituals and traditions, as expressions of the debt impulse in relation to ancestors and eventually God. The late anthropologist David Graeber identified reciprocity as the principle underlying moral modes of exchange, as opposed to the modalities of everyday communism or explicit hierarchy. And although he was skeptical of conceptualizing human interactions as giving one thing for another, his anthropological research crystallized the universality and immediacy of debt concepts in a wide array of moral systems across space and time. We collectively owe Freddie Gray, and those cast into similar circumstances, a sizable debt, and not one that can be commodified and sold like the one he was awarded by a court of law. It is a debt that implicates both procedure and distribution, recognizing that there is, in the first place, an injustice to be rectified, an obligation to be fulfilled, and that we are fully capable of doing so is necessarily a prerequisite for pursuing socioeconomic parity.